Well, let me tell you about my interest in Yellowstone Park. When I was in graduate school and when I was doing my postdoc, it was at a great place, Indiana University in Bloomington. Is a wonderful place if you don't mind being in the Midwest, but I do. And as a result, I wanted to come, I didn't know exactly where, but I wanted to come somewhere in the Northwest. So I took a map of the United States. Remember, this was 1968 or 67 when I started this process. Took a map of the U.S. and drew a line from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, north and west. And then I identified every town, meaning under 50,000, that had either a four-year college or university. And then I set about to visit each one of them and rank them. And that meant I had to have a dissertation topic that would enable me to do this. And my field was economic anthropology. And as my former colleagues at Montana, and some of my former colleagues at Montana State's economics department used to remind me every once in a while, John, you're not a real economist. You're an economic anthropologist, which is precisely correct. So my dissertation was explaining how some people made communism work. Now, you may recall back in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a huge amount of interest in creating communes, little communist societies. And the mean life expectancy of a commune at that time, casual observation, was roughly 3 months. And if they had a Hobart commercial dishwasher, it might make 9 months. But they'd blow up. But the Hutterites, who are one of the three Anabaptists that have survived, they've been communal since God came and spoke with Jacob Hutter in 1829, I think it was. And God told Jacob how people should live. They lived that way, and hence they were successful. You will not be surprised that my dissertation committee did not agree that was sufficient explanation to defend my thesis. So I had the great good fortune of having a very generous grant, Ford Foundation grant, that enabled me to traverse this whole area and actually visit these towns I'd identified. And I ranked them. And you will not be surprised. I ranked them on the variables of obviously the quality of the school, the quality of the environment, and the recreational opportunities. And it had to also have ag and forestry, because that was my background. And you'll not be in the least surprised that Bozeman came out #1, and I ended up being based here. And at that time, Dick McConnell, did you know Dick?
Dick recruited me.
Dick McConnell, PhD from Eastern Montana, PhD in ag economics from Berkeley. He took an interest in my work, and he sort of encouraged me to come here. And it all worked out, and I'm very happy, couldn't be happier about that. So here I am. And I am just, my wife Ramona and I travel a fair amount, she in particular. No matter where we go, no matter how nice it is, I come back and say, this is better than any other place. And I just feel so blessed to be here. It's just quite remarkable. Well, and also I'm blessed that I can not only do work at the ranch, but I can do the academic and intellectual work that appeals to me. And this really does. So I have run environmental studies programs or environmental institutes in several places, and obviously here. And one of the things that I found useful when talking about environmental economics and environmental policy is make a basic division. And I assert that all environmental studies may be divided into two parts. The first involves nasty stuff that comes out of pipes and smokestacks, among other places. And that we call sludge. And we basically do our best to avoid it unless it can be an input for some commercial process. But in general, we want to avoid that in our lives. And the other involves parks, and wilderness and wildlands and range and water and wildlife, and the stuff you see on calendars. You have the picture. And that we call romance. I call romance. So all of environmental studies may be divided into two components, either sludge, which we try to avoid, or romance, in which we like to wallow. And Yellowstone Park exemplifies, and Greater Yellowstone exemplify the romance sector of that policy arena. And that's where we happen to live. Now, my approach, as I indicated, is from economic anthropology. And my goals, when I am doing my writing, my speaking and so forth, is to foster the overlap or the conjunction of three values. Ecological sustainability is one. Second, responsible liberty. And third, modest prosperity. And we try to intellectually foster that. That's sort of the driving force for my work and for our living. And that's a very nice trilogy. At least I find it so. Well, let's go through the course description. What I would like to do is to give a very brief history of Yellowstone. And when I say Yellowstone, I don't mean just the park, but which is what, 2.2 million acres, but Greater Yellowstone, which is ballpark 10 times that. Roughly 20 million acres. Some say 18, some say 22. There's nothing precise about it. But if you talk to wildlife scientists, they all will agree, at least in my experience, they all agree, that Yellowstone can't exist as an island, that it's part of a much larger system, and it's important to preserve not only the park, but also the larger context. And so we will be dealing with that, with the Greater Yellowstone, not just the park. Now, we are living and experiencing and rejoicing in a fundamental transformation in our area. And that is the transition. I mean, we're well past the transition, well along the way of the transition from a commodity-oriented economy to an amenity-oriented economy. I mean, I don't think I haven't met anyone for decades who's come here, meaning in this general area, to make money, to make money by developing natural resources in terms of commodities. That's not the driver now. Sure, there's a little bit of that going on. And I have no idea what the data on this is, but if we talk about the Greater Yellowstone, well, if we talked about all of Montana, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm not asserting this is true, but but it is true that I would not be surprised if we had more yoga instructors and massage therapists than we do miners and loggers. That may be the case. If anyone happens to know, please tell me, because it really is. That would be a very interesting metric to see how that shifts. When I came here initially in '68, there was a fairly thriving logging and timber industry right in the immediate Bozeman area, and gosh, that's basically gone. And by the way, in an earlier life, I was a timber buyer and contract logger, and then I taught forestry for a while, which is great fun, by the way. So we're in a changing cultural context. Initially, Yellowstone was explored by trappers, some of whom had been on the Lewis and Clark expedition, and they returned as trappers, and they wandered through Yellowstone Park. However, when they came back to civilization, meaning St. Louis, mainly St. Louis, people wouldn't believe them. You saw what? No, I mean, how adult is your brain? I mean, what were you doing when you were out in the wilderness for, for a year, 2 years, 5 years, whatever? And so they simply didn't believe the stories that were told. In 1872, the Congress created the Yellowstone National Park, the world's first national park, and very shortly thereafter, we had developments of that sort in the park. It was an attractive place for visitors. However, before there were visitors coming to enjoy the scenery and watch the animals and so forth, there were people who came to poach. And they poached bison and they poached elk, especially elk. Thousands of elk, I'm told. And Yellowstone was protected only by ignorance about it and by the distance. It was very, very hard to get there. You had to be either basically some sort of nomad wandering about, or come on a train. It was expensive. So that we had poachers of not just animals. The bison were selling, the bison heads were selling for some thousands of dollars at this time. So they were definitely worth poaching. And so John Stoddard visited the park in the 1890s and wrote this book, John Stoddard's Lectures on Yellowstone National Park. And many of the photographs that we're going to see were done by John Stoddard. Now, I happened totally by accident. I was in Durham, North Carolina, excuse me. There is a difference. I was there to give a lecture a couple lectures at Duke. And I was staying in a hotel, and they had a little library, as some hotels do now. There's a DoubleTree, and I think the pattern of the DoubleTree is to have some little library area with a big long table, and all the new DoubleTrees. And it was just a good place to work. So I wandered in there, and I worked for a while, and then said, well, what's here? And you may recall, if you've ever been in one of those hotels, that on the wall, the one whole wall will be a bookcase. And the bookcase is filled by interior decorators. And interior decorators sell the books by the foot. And they want pretty books. And so among their favorite books are those published in the early 1900s that were bound. Some of them being bound in leather. I'm sure you've seen them. The Harvard Classics is one example. But there are dozens, probably hundreds of these sets of books. So I'm tired of doing whatever I was doing, and I wandered over and randomly picked a book. Just pulled it out. Oh, what's this about? It was pretty. I mean, it was one of, 19 that looked alike. And I pulled it out, and it had three sort of sub-books within it, and I opened it up, to the first page of John Stoddard's trip to Yellowstone with the pictures. And I said, my goodness gracious, this might not be an accident, but whatever it was, I'm going to take advantage of it. So I opened it up to that page. Well, this was an act of God, perhaps. I don't know. But I was delighted. And I brought it home. And the copyright had expired, 50 years ago or such. And so I took it to Allegra Printing, and I said, can you digitize this and print it? And they said, oh, sure, we can do that. So we have this now. Now, let me tell you a little bit about John Stoddard. Yale is very well represented in this room. And John Stoddard was born in 1859, attended Williams College and then Yale Divinity School. And when he finished his work at the Divinity School, he came from a wealthy background. He said, well, goodness, I think I really like to travel, and I'm going to make my living by visiting exotic places and taking notes and taking photographs, and then go around the country and indeed Europe as well, and give lectures about these really exotic places, you know, like Ceylon and Egypt and Yellowstone Park. And so he went to Yellowstone Park, again, in the 1890s, traveled around and wrote this book. Now, the book, which I've just, I wrote a foreword and an afterward to it to place it in context. It's available at the Gallatin History Museum. I don't know what they're charging for it, but the museum gets all of the proceeds from the book, because I had the book printed with a foundation grant, so I'm not taking anything from it at all. And if you have a membership in the museum, or if you sign up to become a member of the museum, you get the book for free. So John Stoddard wanders around Yellowstone, and he, of course, was enamored of what the trappers had described, and it was, you know, obviously they were doubted. I mean, no one had seen this. Maybe something similar to this on a much smaller scale in Iceland. And there's a boat on Yellowstone Lake. And I don't know if you can tell, but at that time, you couldn't shoot animals there in the park if you were a tourist, but you could fish and keep the fish. And hotels actually hired anglers to catch fish that they served then in the dining rooms. So the military, because it was being essentially poached in a variety of ways, the military came in, and obviously the Civil War was long past, and the Indian Wars had wound down, so the Army didn't have much to do. But they didn't want to be idle. And so they took over, they were assigned, management of the park. And when the Army came in, Thomas Moran came in with them, a great painter of Yellowstone. And I'm sure you've seen many of these paintings. They're quite extraordinary, aren't they? And these paintings, that he brought back from his time in the Army, were used to help persuade Congress that Yellowstone deserved designation as a national park. Never done before in the history of the world. And you can see why they would want, why it made sense to do that. Now, so the Army is managing Yellowstone, and when John Stoddard was there, he goes on at some length that anyone who's been to Yellowstone cannot imagine having it run other than by the Army, because there are these dangers out there, the dangers of poachers, and they put out fires. I mean, they really didn't have much to do. But they did a whole bunch of highly constructive things. Remember, the Army Corps of Engineers, they are really good at designing and building stuff. And even back then, they were. And so they laid out and directed the building, and I'm sure did much of the work themselves, but I don't know how much. A lot of it almost surely was contracted. 400 miles of road. They built a hydroelectric plant at Mammoth. They built bridges. They basically surveyed the roads that we still use today. Did I mention they developed the water system there as well? And I think they did a marvelous job. And Stoddard couldn't imagine any other organization doing it. Well, gee, Yellowstone was an experiment. It was a glorious experiment, but it wasn't handed down like the Ten Commandments. I mean, it was explicit. Any public policy, it really is an experiment to see, and then what? And so, and then what? Well, the Army was basically a temporary custodian, and we were, again, running this experiment. And then what? What do we do next? And so in 1916, Congress created the Park Service. So the Army came in to basically protect the park, and it took over management in 1879, and the Park Service was created in 1916 and took over management in 1919. And the Park Service was one of the agencies created by the progressive movement. The original progressive movement, which dates roughly, I don't know if there are any precise dates on it, from ballpark 1880 to the end of World War I. And the Park Service, and as well as the Forest Service, they had a mission, and the mission was to manage for the greatest good, for the greatest number, for the long term, and to manage by a recipe of sorts, which became a catechism of what they called scientific management. And scientific management was just a remarkably arrogant presumption. And Woodrow Wilson, by the way, was a huge, huge advocate of this, especially when he was teaching it at Princeton, and then implemented it when he was president of Princeton, and implemented that when he became president. But it had this remarkably, in retrospect, arrogant view that an elite set of scientifically trained experts should take over management of much of America. And it had some constructive and positive things, but it also had some really, really terrible things. The eugenics movement, forced sterilization, and so forth. It was just one of the examples of the ideology run amok. But their formula for managing was relatively simple, and that was find young men of good breeding and character, and give them the best of scientific training, and then turn them loose to manage, in the natural resource arena, America's natural resources. Wow. Note, find young men of good breeding and character. It was a terribly, terribly elitist prescription. And it sort of worked for a while. So the progressives created initially forestry schools. And where were they? Well, there was the Harvard Forest, which also did teaching, although it wasn't an official forestry school. There's the Yale School of Forestry, which still exists under a different name. There was Cornell. There was Berkeley. There was University of Michigan, and then, I don't remember the year, in the early 1900s, the University of Montana got a forestry school. But the presumption was, we'll take the fine young men of good breeding and character, send them, they will select to go to the very best schools to get scientific training in new disciplines, including forestry and hydrology and so forth. And then we will send them out to manage for the greatest good, for the greatest number, for the long term. Now, that little phrase applies largely to the Forest Service, but also the same culture permeated the Park Service. Now, the Forest Service, of course, is in the Department of Agriculture while the Park Service is obviously an interior. So we have these fine young men of good breeding and character who've been educated at the finest places, and we turn them loose to manage America's natural resources. Gee, it was almost a sanctified mission. And they had a calling, the people, the men who worked there, had a calling and a presumption that they should have an immense amount of discretion within the agencies, of course, within their parameters, for managing these resources. And so we had scientific management, which meant management by bureaucracies. It is almost surely not an accident that the word bureaucracy carries at least a crust of derision in every known language. It's exceedingly difficult for bureaucracies to take time and place specific information into account. So rather, instead, they have regulations, and they have procedures, and they have policies that become very rigid. And it turns out, of course, that they become relatively insulated from the people and the resources that they are supposed to protect and to manage, to harbor, and to foster. Now, if we move to Yellowstone with the management by the Park Service, we find several pathologies. Bureaucratic, oh, by the way, let me back up and make something very clear. When I talk about the pathologies in the land management agencies, and specifically the Park Service, it is not a matter of corruption as we normally understand it, as we see in Chicago politics and that sort of thing. I mean, I've been involved with this for ever. I mean, for a very, very, very long time. And I mean, I don't explicitly study agencies, but I really don't recall an account of Chicago-style corruption occurring in the Park Service or the Forest Service. I mean, it's not that people are buying preferential access in the normal way. They may through congressional hearings and things, of course. But the kind of corruption that we associate with politics normally, as near as I can tell, the Park Service and the Forest Service are immune from that. So I'm not criticizing them on that dimension. But rather, what we find is an ideology that becomes incorporated into policy, that becomes rigid and insulated from what's going on in the areas they're to manage. Let me talk about several cases. For example, the Park Service understood, the leaders of the Park Service understood that public support for their agency was critically important. And they really needed to have public support because this is sort of a new venture. And it took a budget. The railroads were huge allies of the national parks. Why? Because that's how people got to the national parks. Unless they lived adjacent to them, they'd have to take a choo-choo train there. And at that time, of course, they were choo-choo trains. So they want to please the tour, and you saw, of course, the hotels and so forth. It was a really neat, luxurious set of hotels. And people liked animals. So the Park Service scientists, managers, they divided animals into two types. And basically, they were animals with big brown eyes. Bison and elk and moose, to a lesser extent, deer and a few antelope. So these are big brown-eyed animals, and tourists really liked big-eyed brown animals. And the other kind of animals had squinty yellow eyes. things like wolves and lions. I don't know if lions have squinty eyes, but that's how they're described. And so the move was, the policy was, let's exterminate the bad animals. There are good animals and bad animals. Let's exterminate the bad animals. And so there were big campaigns to basically kill the predators. So kill wolves, lions, not bears, because tourists love bears. But wolves and lions, and to a lesser degree coyotes, which a big coyote, male coyote will weigh 27 pounds. They're not a big threat to a moose, of course. And so they killed the predators. And another thing, of course, that they liked, that the tourists like, was to see bears. And so the Park Service systematically encouraged the hotels to feed the food scraps to bears. And so they would have feeding stations. And when Ramona was a little girl, so she grew up just on a place her family had homesteaded on west of the park. And she grew up as a little girl, often going to the park and watching the bears come to the feeding pits. It was, and there were there were good scientific, well, there were some scientific reasons to do that, because that way the bears get this huge amount of food when they go into hibernation, and therefore their reproduction rates were higher, so you'd have more bears with cubs, and a sow bear with 2 cubs or 3 cubs is even cuter than a sow bear with 1. And so, you know, it made sense to do that. So they killed predators, they fed bears, and they extinguished fires. So what were the results? As I say, this is an experiment. The park is an ongoing experiment. And so we had the creation, and it was, again, protected by what? Ignorance of it and distance. Then we had the Army come in and manage until 1919. And that was basically a custodial role, and building, of course, the roads and the bridges and so forth. And then we had the creation of the Park Service, and the Park Service having this scientific management set of principles. And what happened with this experiment? Well, and then what? That's the question that I think that economists tend to ask when a policy is proposed. You enact it, and then what? What are the logical, predictable, empirical consequences of the policy that you're advocating? So, what happens when you kill all the predators?
You get a lot of elk.
Pardon me?
You get a lot of elk.
You get a huge number of elk. And I say all the predators, it's a little bit of question about when the last wolf was killed, but 1927 seems to be, that's about the time. They were all going by 1930. And so, what's going to prey on elk? Well, essentially nothing. And what do elk really like to do? They really like to make more elk. And so the numbers of elk kept going up and up and up and up. The National Academy of Sciences had, I think it was at least 3 major studies of the carrying capacity of the park for elk. And the numbers they came up with never exceeded 9,000. They were as low as about 5,500. And 9,000 plus a little bit, I think, was the highest that I recall. Never hit 10,000. Again, but how many elk were in the park at maximum? Something in excess of 40,000. And what do animals do when you have too many animals on a given range? Well, they abuse it. They overbrowse. they overgraze, and they change the composition of the ecological system. So it deteriorates dramatically after a while. But there was, of course, I mean, everyone knows how to manage if you have too many animals, right? What do? Well, you harvest them. Yeah, but it turned out that people really, really didn't like to hear that the Park Service, which is supposed to be there to protect the park and the animals in the park, is actually out there killing the elk. And this was a huge political problem for them. And it was one they never could solve. They tried all manner, well, let's capture them and give them to the Indians. Well, that was a slight improvement. But still, there was a huge amount of public opposition. So the number of elk just kept going up and up and up. And then finally, there was a solution. And anyone remember what the solution was?
Wolves.
1995, the reintroduction of the wolves, and I'll be talking about that at some length later. We were involved with some of the people, the elders, the wisdom of the elders, who basically helped rectify the series of problems that were generated by the scientific management paradigm. Well, so we killed the predators and we fed bears. There were these feeding stations with the bears, and what happens to bears that get fed? Well, number one, they do go into hibernation in really quite good shape. I mean, there were tons of good food, I mean good from a nutritional standpoint, put out by the hotels that the bears would just gorge on. But what happens then to the bears? Well, the bears associate people with food. And what does that mean? Well, it means they become mischievous, and sometimes they become really quite dangerous. And as a result, they have conflicts with people. And what happens if you're a Park Service manager and your bears are eating your tourists? Not that it was all that common, but it did occur, and it was always a big threat. And so there was a saying in the Park Service, a fed bear becomes a dead bear, because the bears get in trouble. And then the Park Service has to extinguish them. In an earlier life, Ramon and I ran a fairly substantial sheep operation. And in being involved with the Montana wool growers, I talked to, obviously, a lot of people who used to run a lot of sheep. This was several decades ago, and they were saying that in the 1950s and the early 60s, there were something like 15 bands of sheep run in the Spanish Peaks area. A band is 1,000 sheep. And there would be one herder for every 1,000 to 1,200, 1,250 sheep. And now this is what this guy told me. And he claimed it was true. I don't know if it was, but I assume it was. It was for sure it's true that his family ran a lot of sheep. And they ran them up in the Spanish Peaks area. And he said there were other bands run up there. He said it was common for the Park Service to show up with a trailer that had the culvert traps they have for bears, with a bear culvert in it, and there'd be a bear in the culvert, and they take them out into the sheep grounds and open the doors and turn them loose. And then they would retreat, or not retreat, they would return, not retreat, back to the park with an empty bear container. Well, what did the sheep herders do when the park's pickup and trailer left? They shot the bears. And then they would skin the bears and sell the pelts. But that was one of the strategies that evolved. Now, it wasn't, was that corruption in a normal sense? Of course not. The sheep herders didn't bribe them to do this, but the Park Service had, of course, to evolve to deal with this problem. It's been claimed that the creation of the national parks was America's best idea. I certainly agree it's one of the very best ideas. I just think it's marvelous. The question is, how can we sustain the parks? How can we keep them from being crushed? And if not by elk, then next is going to come, we're going to have a huge problem with bison, and we'll talk about that later, and people. And as I mentioned when I tried to introduce myself, I approach this not as a real economist, but as someone in economic anthropology. And so culture, most economists score very, very lowly on an empathy index. And, well, no, empirically, there's no question but what that's true. They're not the very lowest, but they're way below. They're on the left side of the bell curve by a lot. And so they're low on empathy, and they discount the importance of culture. Now, do all of them? No, not all of them, but the vast majority do. People who feel that calculus is the most compelling form of communication, that's an unusual position to take. And as a result, of course, they often don't pay attention to the cultural context of how things operate. They just sort of, it's not an important variable. In fact, I don't remember, I've been in several economics departments, and I remember one, and I don't remember who it was, but this person, because I come from anthropology, okay? And this person said, culture is the last refuge of people who can't do statistics and econometrics. But one of the things that is happening, not only did the park have this terrible situation with elk that would just ravage the landscape and transform the ecology in adverse ways, it also has problems managing people and constraining the number of people who come into a national park. How do you limit access to a park? I mean, that's a serious problem. Many years ago, the Forest Service hired me to write a pamphlet on how to ration wilderness areas when the same sorts of problem arise, because people, I'm a citizen, it's my park. Well, see, we have a rationing problem. I mean, this is a classic rationing problem. We have a finite resource. We have demand for it that's expanding. Okay, there are constraints on how many people can come in. We can modify their behavior. No cars, you have to shuttle things or whatever. There are all manner of things that we could do to modify the behavior a bit. That's correct, surely, but it is a rationing problem. Now, what is the normal way we deal with rationing in America? Pardon me? Price. Price, because what you've just suggested is the social analog of the law of gravity. As prices rise, demand falls. Notice what we're exploring now is how this evolution will occur. I mean, I think everyone agrees that there will be an evolution in the management regime. We will see something. Look, the Park Service is going to adjust. There will be an evolution, and every policy adjustment is an experiment. And we don't have really clear data immediately, of course, but it will evolve. Anyone remember when West Yellowstone advertised itself as being the snowmobile capital of the world? because we had, for snowmobiles, we had open access, like the original park, like Yellowstone was when it was created. If you can get there, have at it. And then the same thing, of course, happened when snowmobiles came along. And when they were first introduced, they were all two-cycle engines. The only thing that should be a two-cycle engine is a chainsaw, and I love the sound of that, by the way. But I don't like it in a snowmobile. And so it was polluting. Do any of you remember being at the gate, going in, at West Yellowstone Gate, going into the park back when there were thousands of snow machines there, all two-cycle, sitting there waiting? And it would be it's like worse than it is now with the forest fires, because it's more localized. I mean, it was really quite remarkable. And so there was an evolution that involved a change in regulation and a change in technology and constraints on the numbers. And all manner of people in West Yellowstone were terribly upset about this, terribly upset, because a constituency developed around snowmobiles. Because when Ramona was a little girl, living on a farm near Ashton, Idaho, she said Yellowstone would basically close down in the winter before snowmobiles. I mean, they said the liquor store was open, there were 2 gas stations, there was one hotel, I don't remember which it was. And other than that, it was basically closed. There wasn't anything to do. And then with the advent of snowmobiles becoming popular, you'd have these semis come from Wisconsin and Minnesota carrying snowmobiles, and then people would arrive here however, driving, flying, or whatever, pick up their snow machines, go to the park and roar around and spend a lot of money. So a constituency developed in West Yellowstone, and changing that was a big deal. One of the things that we know is not all problems have solutions at all, and very few problems have cost-free solutions. Sometimes entrepreneurs figure out ways where everyone gains. I mean, that does in fact happen. But everyone agrees we do have a rationing problem. We've now explored some of the problems that we're going to encounter with various rationing systems. And I will be astounded if we don't see some of them being at least discussed and efforts made to actually implement some of them. So there are lots of experiments going on, and institutions they can learn, and the smart people in them they know these problems exist, and the crowding problem is one that they for sure know exists. Now, I'm intrigued that when I open the door to culture and cultural differences, that no one mentioned one obvious one, and because it's politically incorrect to do so. So let me do that. Ramon and I go to Yellowstone quite often, and we. Free's website, when you open it, free-eco.org, as Doug mentioned, when you open it up, if you do, in the upper right is something called the Yellowstone Suite, and then a link that you click to get there. And what this is, it includes, among other things, this book, but it also has interviews with lots of, not lots of people, with a few people who had a huge amount of influence in basically fixing, or at least ameliorating, the problems that were plaguing the park in terms of the elk and the bears and so forth. And so we spent a lot of time talking to people in the Park Service, people who are dealing with these actual problems. And one of the things, no names will be mentioned, but one of the things that came up fairly often was the importance of culture. That they didn't say it that way, but that's what they were referring to. And in particular, they were lamenting the fact that many of the foreign visitors to Yellowstone, we were only interviewing people at Yellowstone, didn't share the culture that almost surely all of us share in terms of how to behave. And there was a particular problem with extremely large numbers of Chinese who relatively all of a sudden have a lot of money. Like they have the same sort of income that average Americans do, but they had quite different expectations for how to behave when they were in a national park. And park officials were telling us horror stories of things that they did, not maliciously. I mean, they weren't poaching animals and doing stuff like that. They were just behaving in ways that we would consider grossly irresponsible and mainly inconsiderate and irresponsible and destructive, not intending to destroy stuff. I mean, they weren't like taking, chisels and putting their initials or on stones, but they were just, by their behavior, they were destroying things. Embedded in our culture is some sort of expectations about what the proper condition and role of Yellowstone is. And we see this threat looming, and there are other threats looming in addition to human population, and we'll talk about them later for sure. But I just really like the fact that we are explicitly talking about experiments to deal with a problem that we know exists, that we fear will get worse, and gee, what would work? And we have smart people in the agencies who are scouting around for not solutions, but for ways to manage problems. And the leaders will be acutely aware of the political forces that several of you have mentioned. How many people in the room were born in Bozeman? Oh, well, now, how did it happen that you live here? How many people were assigned to be here by their company or their agency? One. Okay, that's a rather small proportion. That's 4% of the audience are here because they were assigned here. I'm not sure I totally understand that, but that's okay. So you were here by choice. I made a very systematic search across the Northwest U.S. But nearly everyone here elected to come here. And you may not have come to be adjacent to Yellowstone Park, but that almost surely didn't detract from you. All right, you did come to be adjacent to Yellowstone Park. Yeah. That's sort of unusual.
You can probably tell how passionate I am.
Well, you are, of course. But the fact is that because of the park, and more importantly, for my purposes, Greater Yellowstone, it offers essentially a wonderfully rich amenity shed. And we have the additional advantage of, I would argue, the very best airport in the world for a population of this size. We are on an interstate highway, and we have an ambitious and highly successful university. Good Lord.
And we have Wonderlust.
And we have Wonderlust. No, and that's a good point, because we have this amazingly rich cultural environment. It is just an astounding place to live. And so, of course, lots and lots and lots of people want to be here. And the only thing here, I will argue, that is more expensive than average in the United States are housing prices. Of course, we have constraints on supply. Like our ranch, we put it in a conservation easement. Okay, we paid to put it, we didn't take county money, we're libertarian. We paid to put it in a conservation easement. Well, that means there's a fair chunk of land that will not grow houses. And this is encouraged. We've passed several bonds to pay people to put stuff in a conservation easement. And there are all these other constraints that are being put on development to keep not just Yellowstone Park, but Greater Yellowstone attractive in the way it was when it attracted us here. And again, I'm glad you mentioned Wonderlust. There's so many wonderful cultural things here. And the number of nonprofits we have here is extraordinary. I don't know if this is true, but several people who study these things have told me that Gallatin County has more nonprofits than King County, Washington, which is Seattle, and all of that. So at any rate, there are lots of wonderful things, and one of the wonderful things is the opportunity to come and meet with you all. I'm really delighted. It's been fun for me, and I look forward to 3 more of these adventures. Thank you. Bye-bye.